Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 15 on psychological disorders. Think about times you've heard phrases like, I'm so OCD, they're crazy, or I'm depressed, just tossed around casually. Now, compare that to sitting with someone who can't leave their house because of panic, or someone whose depression makes brushing their teeth feel impossible. In this chapter, we're going to explore how psychologists and other licensed professionals define and classify psychological disorders, and why abnormal is more complicated than weird or different. By the end of this chapter, you will be able to describe what counts as a psychological disorder and why, interpret basic diagnostic language, and recognize the core features of several major disorder categories. The goal is not for you to diagnose people in your life, but to see psychological disorders with more nuance, accuracy, and compassion. As we move through this chapter, you may notice pieces of yourself or people you know in some of these descriptions. That's really normal. Many of the traits and experiences we're going to talk about, like anxiety, mood shifts, attention issues, and trauma responses, exist on a spectrum, and most people will relate to at least something in these slides. Seeing yourself in a symptom list does not mean you have that disorder. A diagnosis depends on how long the symptoms have been present, how many are present together, how intense they are, and how much they interfere with daily life and functioning. And that assessment is made by a trained mental health professional, not by a checklist in this slide deck. If you ever find yourself wondering whether what you're experiencing might be more than normal stress or normal experience, that's a good time to talk with a counselor, a doctor, or other qualified professionals rather than trying to self-diagnose. When we talk about psychological disorders, what we're really talking about is the patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are causing problems in a person's life. The field that studies those patterns is called psychopathology. Psychopathology looks at symptoms, where they come from, and how they can be treated. So when you hear terms like depression, anxiety, or schizophrenia or OCD, those all fall under the umbrella of psychological disorders that psychopathology tries to understand more clearly. It helps to notice that words like abnormal can be misleading. Something can be unusual without being a disorder. So, red hair, for example, is statistically atypical, but it isn't a sign that something is wrong or harmful with the person. Psychological disorders involve more than just being different. They involve patterns that interfere with living, create distress, or put someone or others at risk. Culture has a lot to say about what counts as normal or abnormal. Behaviors that fit expectations in one culture can look strange or even alarming in another. For example, hearing the voice of a deceased ancestor might be cherished in one cultural or religious context, while in another it might be labeled as hallucinations and assumed to be symptoms of a psychotic disorder. Because of that, psychologists have to be careful not to confuse different from my culture with disordered. Wakefield's idea of harmful dysfunction tries to give a more careful definition. A dysfunction means some internal psychological mechanism, like perception, thinking, or emotional regulation, isn't doing what it's supposed to do. For that dysfunction to count as a disorder, it also needs to be harmful, causing real negative consequences according to that person's cultural context. So, a belief or behavior that is unusual but not harmful, or a mechanism that's different but still working for the person, would not automatically be labeled as a disorder. So think about something that your family or community sees as normal that other people might see as weird or odd. Does that make it disordered or just culturally different? The American Psychiatric Association pulls these ideas together into a working definition. According to the APA, a psychological disorder involves significant disturbances in a person's thoughts, emotions, or behavior. Those disturbances reflect some kind of dysfunction in biological, psychological, or developmental processes. So, something about how the brain, mind, or development is working has gone off track in a way that isn't just a personality quirk. On top of that, the pattern has to lead to distress or disability. Distress means the person is suffering emotionally, and disability means it's hard to go to work, go to school, keep up with responsibilities, or maintain relationships. The APA also notes that we don't label every strong reaction as a disorder. Intense grief after losing someone, for example, can be a painful but culturally expected response, not a sign of psychopathology. There isn't a perfect bright line between disordered and not disordered, but this helps to give us some framework that goes beyond, well, that's weird. Once professionals agree on what a disorder is in general, they need a shared system for describing specific disorders. And that's where the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, or the DSM, comes in. The DSM is published by the American Psychiatric Association and has gone through multiple editions as our understandings have changed. Earlier editions, for example, classified homosexuality as a disorder, and later editions removed it as research and social attitudes have shifted. The DSM lists each recognized disorder, describes its main features, and lays out diagnostic criteria, which is the specific symptoms, on how long they have to be present and what else needs to be ruled out. It also includes information about how common each disorder is, typical age of onset, risk factors, and the patterns of comorbidity. The DSM is essentially a shared language so that when one clinician says major depressive disorder and another clinician says the same thing, they're referring to the same cluster of symptoms and impairment. Prevalence is about how common different types of disorders are in a population. The chart you see here comes from DSM-4 era data, comparing categories like anxiety disorders and mood disorders, substance-related disorders in adult men and women in the United States. Even though we now use DSM-5 and now DSM-5 text revision, these numbers still give a good picture. Psychological disorders are not rare. A significant percentage of adults will meet criteria for at least one disorder at some point in their lives. You can also see differences by gender in certain categories. For example, anxiety and mood disorders tend to be more commonly diagnosed in women, while substance-related disorders are more frequently diagnosed in men. It's important to remember that these are diagnostic rates, which are influenced by who seeks help, who gets screened, how symptoms show up in different people. The takeaway is that psychological disorders are common enough that almost everyone will be impacted either personally or through someone they know. Another pattern that shows up in this data is comorbidity, which means having more than one disorder at the same time. The example here is the frequent overlap between obsessive-compulsive disorder and major depressive disorder. A person might struggle both with intrusive anxiety-provoking thoughts and compulsions and with the low mood, loss of interest, and other symptoms of depression. Comorbidity makes real-world diagnosis and treatment more complex than textbook lists. Symptoms often blend together, and one disorder can increase the risk of another. For instance, chronic anxiety can wear a person down and contribute to depression, and depression can make it harder to use coping strategies for anxiety. When clinicians assess someone, they're often not asking which disorder fits, but really what combinations of patterns are we actually seeing here, and how does one influence or impact the other? The DSM is not the only classification of disorders. Globally, many professionals use the International Classification of Diseases, or the ICD, published by the World Health Organization. The ICD covers all kinds of health conditions, not just mental health disorders, and includes a section devoted to mental and behavioral health disorders. Its criteria are similar to the DSM's in many areas, but there are some differences in categories and wording sometimes. In practice, the DSM tends to be used more in the United States mental health settings, and in much of the psychological world, you will read, while the ICD is heavily used worldwide for clinical work, health statistics, and billing. Both such systems are trying to do the same basic thing: create consistent research-informed ways to describe and categorize patterns of suffering so people can get the appropriate help. Looking back in history, psychological disorders were not always seen as medical or psychological problems. In many times and places, unusual behavior or experiences were explained through supernatural lenses: possession by spirits, curses, witchcraft, or punishment from a higher power. People who heard voices, behaved unpredictably, or broke strong social rules might have been seen as morally or spiritually corrupt rather than unwell. Treatments followed from those beliefs. So instead of therapy or medication, responses might include exorcism, confinement, beatings, or other forms of punishment meant to drive out evil or correct moral failure. When you see that history, it becomes easier to understand why stigma has attached itself so strongly to mental illness and why shifting to more scientific, compassionate frameworks are really important. Dancing mania is a dramatic example from medieval Europe where groups of people would suddenly begin to dance uncontrollably, sometimes for hours or days. Reports describe people shouting, seeing disturbing visions, and collapsing from exhaustion. At the time, many believed supernatural forces were at work, possession, curses, or divine judgment, to explain behavior that was so bizarre and frightening. From a modern perspective, there are lots of hypotheses: mass psychogenic illness, social contagions, reactions to stress or toxins, or something else entirely. What matters for this is that the same behavior can be understood in very different ways depending on the time period and cultural framework. The label you put on behavior, demonic, medical, psychological, shapes how people respond to it and how those affected are treated. Imagine seeing something like dancing mania today. How do you think people would explain it now compared to 500 years ago? It's interesting to think about. As science advanced, explanations for psychological disorders began to shift towards biological factors. This perspective focuses on genetics, brain structure and function, and chemical signaling between neurons. Family and twin studies show that many disorders run in families, suggesting that some people are born with vulnerabilities that increase their likelihood of developing certain conditions. Schizophrenia is a clear example. The closer your genetic relationship to someone with schizophrenia, the higher your own risk, even though most relatives never develop the disorder. Biological research also looks at differences in brain areas involved in mood, thinking, and perception, and at neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. The biological perspective doesn't deny the importance of the environment, but it does emphasize that the brain and body are deeply involved in psychological disorders. To pull these pieces together, the diathesis stress models suggest that disorders usually emerge from a mix of vulnerability and life experiences. A diathesis is a predisposition or vulnerability. This could be genetic, biological, or psychological, like a tendency towards certain thinking patterns. Stress includes the environmental events and conditions that challenge a person, like trauma, loss, chronic conflict, discrimination, or ongoing pressure. Someone with a strong diathesis might develop a disorder after relatively moderate stress, while someone with little to no diathesis might only develop problems after extreme or prolonged stress. This model helps explain why not everyone who lives through a difficult event develops PTSD, depression, or other diagnoses. It's the interaction between what a person brings into the situation and what happens to them that shapes whether a pattern rises to the level of a psychological disorder. Fear and anxiety are related, but they are not identical. Fear is your body's immediate reaction to a real present threat, like almost getting hit in traffic. Anxiety is more about anticipating possible threats, worrying about what might go wrong on an exam, in a relationship, or at work. A certain level of anxiety is useful. It helps you plan, prepare, and avoid danger, but it becomes problematic when it's more intense than the situation calls for, shows up constantly, or interferes with your daily life. Anxiety disorders are a group of conditions where fear and anxiety are excessive, persistent, and linked to changes in behavior, usually avoidance. People might start avoiding places, people, or activities because they fear panic, embarrassment, or danger. These disorders are very, very common. A substantial portion of adults will meet criteria for at least one anxiety disorder at some point, and they're diagnosed way more often in women than in men. The big picture is that these are not rare experiences on the edge of society. They are a part of what many people are quietly carrying around. A specific phobia is an intense, persistent fear of a particular object or situation, like spiders, needles, flying, heights, or enclosed spaces. The fear is out of proportion to the actual danger, and the person usually knows that logically. Someone might be fully aware that commercial flying is statistically very, very safe, but still experience near panic just thinking about getting on an airplane. The diagnosis focuses on how strong the fear is, how long it has lasted, and how much it interferes with normal life. People with specific phobias often go to great lengths to avoid the feared object or situation. Driving instead of flying, even when it's impractical, skipping medical injections, avoiding elevators, climbing multiple flights of stairs, or refusing activities like swimming or hiking. Over time, life can shrink around the phobia. A related condition is called agoraphobia, which involves fear and avoidance of situations where escape might be difficult or help unavailable if panic-like symptoms occur. Things like public transportation, open spaces, crowds, or being outside alone. The common thread is that anxiety is steering decisions more than the actual risk. Specific phobias often develop through learning, not just random fears. One route is classical conditioning. So imagine a child being bitten by a dog. The pain and fear from the bite get paired with the sight of dogs, so later just seeing a dog can trigger anxiety, even if the dog is calm. Another route is vicarious learning, so watching someone else respond with intense fear. For example, if you repeatedly see a parent scream and freeze at the sight of spiders, your brain may connect spiders with danger even if you've never been bitten. A third route is verbal transmission of information. So hearing messages like those dogs will attack you or flying is so dangerous, those planes crash all the time, can build fear without direct experience. Interestingly, some fears are more common and easier to condition than others. Snakes, spiders, and heights are really common. One explanation is that humans may be biologically prepared to fear things that posed real threats across evolutionary history, so those associations are easier to form and harder to extinguish. So, if you think about any strong fear that you might have, big or small, do you remember it coming from something that happened to you, something you saw happen to someone else, or something you were told over and over again? Social anxiety disorder involves intense fear or anxiety in social situations where a person might be judged, criticized, or rejected. This can show up in public speaking, meeting new people, eating or drinking in front of others, answering questions in class, or even using public restrooms. The worry usually centers around being humiliated, saying something stupid, looking awkward, blushing, shaking, or being seen as boring or unlikable. It's more than just shyness. It's strong enough that people start turning down opportunities, withdrawing from others, or enduring social situations with extreme, extreme distress. Many people with social anxiety use safety behaviors to try to manage the fear. These might include avoiding eye contact, speaking very quietly, rehearsing what they're going to say over and over, sticking to familiar people only, or using substances to feel less anxious in social settings. These strategies can take the edge off in the moment, but actually keep the disorder going because the person never gets much experience of, I can handle this without all the extra effort. Over time, social anxiety can interfere with school, work, friendships, and dating, and it's often linked to higher risk of alcohol misuse as a coping tool. A panic attack is a sudden surge of intense fear or discomfort that peaks within minutes. During an attack, people can experience racing heart, sweating, trembling, shortness of breath, chest pain, nausea, dizziness, chills or heat sensation, numbness or tingling, and feelings of unreality. On top of the physical sensations, there's often a sense of impending doom, like I'm going to die, I'm losing control, or I'm going crazy. It's common for people to go to the emergency room the first time it happens because it feels so much like a medical emergency. Having a panic attack is not the same as having panic disorder. Panic disorder is diagnosed when a person has recurrent, unexpected panic attacks and then spends at least a month worrying about more attacks, worrying about what they mean, like having a heart problem or going insane, or changing their behavior to avoid situations they fear will trigger an attack. Life can start to revolve around avoiding anything that might bring on those sensations, like exercise, crowded places, driving long distances, or being too far from home. It's not just the attack itself, but it's the fear of the fear and the shrinking of life that follows. Panic disorder seems to grow out of a combination of biological vulnerability, learning, and thinking styles. Biologically, people with panic disorder are more likely to have relatives with the same problem, suggesting a genetic component. Brain regions like the locus coeruleus, which plays a key role in the body's alarm system and releases norepinephrine, appear to be involved in triggering the physical side of panic. When that system overreacts, the body can slam into full fight or flight mode with little to no warning. From a learning perspective, the body's normal sensations become conditioned signals of danger. Maybe you've had your first panic attack while your heart was already beating fast from climbing stairs. After that, any slight increase in heart rate can feel like the start of another attack. So the fear comes on even before anything is really wrong. Cognitively, people with panic disorder often catastrophize those sensations, interpreting them as proof of serious medical or mental collapse, which then ramps up anxiety further and completes a vicious cycle. Treatments that help people reinterpret and gradually face these sensations can break that cycle, sometimes as effectively as medication. Generalized anxiety disorder is less about sudden spikes of panic and more about a constant background of worry noise. People with generalized anxiety disorder often describe their mind as always on, scanning for what could go wrong: health, school, finances, work, relationships, safety of loved ones. The worry is excessive, hard to control, and present more days than not for at least 6 months. It's not limited to one specific situation. It keeps hopping from topic to topic. Along with the mental worry, generalized anxiety disorder includes physical and emotional symptoms: restlessness, feeling keyed up or on edge, being easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating, irritability, muscle tension, and sleep problems. The result is that people often feel worn out, tense, and distracted, even though they might not be able to point to one big event that's causing it. Generalized anxiety disorder is relatively common and frequently overlaps with depression and other anxiety disorders, which can make it easy for people to chalk it up to, this is just who I am, it's my personality, rather than recognizing it as a treatable pattern. Cognitive models suggest that in generalized anxiety disorder, worry can function as a strategy for avoiding deeper emotional experiences. If someone has a history of painful or chaotic experiences, constantly thinking through what if scenarios can keep their attention on possible future problems instead of on old wounds or unresolved feelings. Worry feels like doing something, planning, preparing, staying alert, even if it doesn't actually solve a whole lot. It can become a mental habit that's really hard to turn off. Research also shows that childhood maltreatment and chronic stress are strong risk factors for generalized anxiety disorder later in life. Growing up in environments where there's instability, criticism, neglect, or abuse can shape a person's core beliefs about the world, such as something bad is always about to happen, and about themselves, like, I won't be able to handle it. Those beliefs feed into ongoing worry and hypervigilance. Genetics and temperament play a role too, but they interact with these kinds of experiences rather than determining someone's fate by themselves. If you've noticed worry in your own life, does it feel more like it helps you prepare and cope, or more like it keeps you stuck, tired, and replaying the same fears without much change? Obsessive compulsive disorder is built around two core pieces: obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are intrusive, unwanted thoughts, images, or urges that pop into someone's mind and feel disturbing or out of character. Common themes include contamination, like I touch something dirty and I'll make everyone sick; doubts, like what if I didn't really lock the door or turn off my flat iron; symmetry or order, or aggressive and sexual thoughts that clash with the person's values. These thoughts don't feel chosen, they feel like mental intruders that bring on a lot of anxiety. Compulsions are the repetitive behaviors or mental acts the person feels driven to perform to try to reduce that anxiety or prevent some feared event. That might look like washing hands over and over and over again, checking a lock repeatedly, counting, repeating phrases silently, or arranging objects until they're just right. The person usually knows these rituals are excessive or irrational, but the distress feels so intense that not doing them feels unbearable. Over time, obsessions and compulsions can eat up large chunks of the day and interfere with school, work, and relationships, even though from the outside in can look like just being picky or really clean. Lifetime prevalence sits at a few percent of the population. So, again, this is not something that's rare. OCD often gets reduced in casual conversation to, I'm so OCD about my desk. But real compulsions are not about preferences. They're about feeling forced to do something to get even temporary relief. Repetitive hand washing is a classic example. Someone might scrub until their skin is raw because their brain is screaming that they're contaminated and might harm themselves or others. The relief after washing is real, but it's so short lived, and the obsession usually comes right back. Checking is another really common pattern, repeatedly making sure the stove is off, the door is locked, or a message was sent correctly. Other compulsions include ordering items until they feel right, counting to certain numbers, or repeating words mentally. From the outside, these can look quirky or voluntary, but for the person with experiencing OCD, they feel urgent and necessary. Skipping a ritual can spike anxiety so sharply that the ritual becomes the only thing that feels like it will bring it down, which is part of how the cycle stays so strong. Body dysmorphic disorder centers on a belief that there is something deeply wrong or flawed about one's physical appearance, even when other people either don't notice it or see it as minor. The focus might be on skin, hair, nose, jawline, or any other body area. Someone with body dysmorphic disorder might spend a lot of time thinking about how disfigured they are, comparing themselves to others, and imagining that everyone else is staring at or judging this one perceived flaw. This preoccupation leads to repetitive behaviors like frequent mirror checking, grooming and camouflaging the area, changing clothes multiple times, seeking reassurance, or even pursuing cosmetic procedures that rarely bring lasting relief. The problem is not vanity, it's distress. People with body dysmorphic disorder can feel intense shame, avoid social situations, or struggle to leave the house because they're convinced others will see them as disgusting or broken. Just like in OCD, they often intellectually know the reaction is extreme, but emotionally it feels completely real. Hoarding disorder involves a persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions regardless of their actual value. To someone looking in from the outside, items may look like junk or trash. To the person with hoarding disorder, the objects feel important because they might be useful someday, because they hold sentimental meaning, or simply because getting rid of them feels overwhelmingly wrong or distressing. Decisions about discarding become so emotionally loaded that they are often avoided altogether. Over time, possessions accumulate to the point that living spaces become cluttered and unusable. Beds, kitchen counters, hallways, and bathrooms can get buried. This isn't just about being messy or disorganized. The clutter makes it hard to cook, sleep, move around safely, or welcome other people into the home. Fire hazards, falls, and conflicts with landlords or family members become really real risks. To diagnose hoarding disorder, clinicians also have to rule out other explanations, like hoarding that's solely due to another medical or mental health condition. There's strong evidence that OCD has a genetic component. It tends to run in families, and twin studies show higher match rates for identical twins than fraternal twins. Some of that risk appears linked to genes involved in serotonin, dopamine, and glutamate systems, chemicals that help neurons communicate. That doesn't mean there's a single OCD gene, but it does suggest that some people are born with brains that are more likely to develop OCD type patterns under the right conditions. Learning processes help explain how OCD locks in. So imagine someone experiences a spike of anxiety while seeing a certain object or having a specific thought. If they then perform a ritual like washing, checking, or counting, and their anxiety drops, that ritual is negatively reinforced, and relief makes the behavior more likely to happen again the next time anxiety shows up. Over time, neutral things become triggers for obsessive thoughts, and the compulsions become automatic responses. The person isn't choosing this cycle so much as getting pulled into it by a nervous system that's learning, if I do this ritual, I will feel better, even if it's only temporary. Biology and learning come together in what researchers sometimes call the OCD circuit, a set of connected brain regions involved in evaluating information, generating emotional responses, and deciding how to act. The orbitofrontal cortex, in particular, is important for decision making and signaling when something feels wrong, out of place, or potentially dangerous. In people with OCD, this region tends to be unusually active, especially when they encounter things that trigger their obsessions, such as a dirty surface or an object that feels to be misaligned. When the circuit keeps firing, the brain keeps sending something's not right, fix it messages, even when there's no real danger. Compulsions like washing or checking can momentarily quiet the circuit, which again makes them feel more likely to be repeated. Understanding these brain patterns doesn't mean people with OCD are doomed to them. It means treatment can target both the hardware through medication that affects neurotransmitters and the software through therapies that change the learned patterns of thoughts and behaviors. When you think about OCD framed in this way, biological vulnerability, learned relief cycles, and brain circuits, how does that change the way you hear someone say, I'm so OCD, as a joke or casual description? Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a trauma and stressor-related disorder. It develops after a person is exposed to a traumatic event that involves actual or threatened death, serious injury, or violence. That exposure can happen in different ways: directly experiencing it, witnessing it happen to somebody else, learning that it happened to a close family member or friend, or being repeatedly exposed to details of trauma, like first responders who constantly encounter violent scenes. PTSD was first described in combat veterans, but it can follow car accidents, assaults, abuse, natural disasters, and many other traumatic experiences. The symptoms fall into several clusters of categories. There are intrusive memories like distressing recollections, nightmares, or flashbacks, episodes where the person feels as if the event is happening again and again and may even act as if they're back in that space. There's avoidance of the reminders of the trauma, so avoiding people, places, conversations, or even thoughts and feelings connected to what happened. Then there's negative changes in the mood and thinking, such as persistent fear, guilt, shame, or feeling detached from other people. And there's changes in arousal and reactivity, like irritability, anger outbursts, being jumpy or easily startled, and trouble sleeping. These symptoms have to last at least 1 month and cause real problems in work, relationships, or daily life to meet the criterion for PTSD. But not everyone who goes through traumatic experiences develops PTSD, which is where risk factors come in. Some types of trauma carry higher risk than others. So, events where people are intentionally harmed by others, like assault, sexual violence, or combat, are more likely to lead to PTSD than accidents or natural disasters. What happens after the trauma matters too. People who have strong social support from friends, family, or community members who listen, help with practical needs, and stay present tend to be less likely to develop PTSD. People who are isolated, blamed, or not believed are at much higher risk. There are also individual factors that raise vulnerability. Being female, having lower socioeconomic status, or lower access to education are linked with higher rates of PTSD, as are a personal history of other mental health conditions and childhood adversity like abuse or neglect. Certain personality traits, such as high neuroticism, which is the tendency toward negative emotions, and somatization, which is the tendency to experience stress as physical symptoms, also increase risk. On the biological side, some people carry genetic variations related to serotonin regulation that seem to make PTSD more likely in the presence of trauma. None of these factors guarantee PTSD, but their absence doesn't guarantee protection. But together, they do help to explain why two people can go through similar events and have very different long-term outcomes. Learning theories help explain how PTSD symptoms develop and stick around. During the trauma, the event itself acts as an unconditioned stimulus that naturally triggers intense fear and distress. The sights, sounds, smells, bodily sensations, and thoughts present at the time can become conditioned stimuli. Later, when a person encounters something that resembles those cues, a loud noise, a certain smell, a news story, the time of year, those reminders trigger the same intense fear response, even though the danger itself is no longer present. That's why a backfiring car can send a combat veteran to the ground, or a particular cologne can suddenly make a survivor feel panicked. Cognitive processes also play a big role. Memories of the trauma are often fragmented and disorganized, making it hard to place what happened in a clear narrative with beginning, middle, and end. Instead of feeling like something awful that happened in the past, the event can feel unfinished and very present, which feeds intrusive memories and flashbacks. On top of that, people may develop negative appraisals about the trauma and themselves. Beliefs like, it was my fault, I am permanently damaged, or nowhere is safe. These beliefs can lead to behaviors like avoidance, withdrawal, and self blame that keep the symptoms going and prevent new, more balanced beliefs from forming. When you think about this mix of learning, memory, and beliefs, how does it change the way you view someone who just can't get over a traumatic event, even though it happened a long time ago? Mood disorders involve more than just being in a bad mood. They are patterns where a person's emotional state is shifted so far, either up into depression or up into mania, that it distorts how they see themselves, other people in the future, and it interferes with daily functioning. When we talk about mood disorders, we're usually talking about depressive disorders where low mood and loss of interest dominate, or bipolar and related disorders where people move between depression and mania. So it means a distinct period of abnormally elevated, expansive, or irritable mood, plus a noticeable increase in energy or activity that lasts at least a week, or less if hospitalization is needed. During mania, a person might feel wired, invincible, or wildly productive, but their judgment is often impaired, and they can make choices that are risky or out of character. So, in this section, we're looking at conditions where mood shifts stop being normal ups and downs and start becoming episodes that seriously impact functioning. Major depressive disorder is what most people think of when they hear clinical depression. To meet criteria, a person has to experience at least 2 weeks of either a depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, or a clear loss of interest or pleasure in almost all of their activities that they used to enjoy. On top of that, they need a total of 5 or more additional symptoms, and those symptoms have to cause distress or difficulty in daily life. The symptom list includes changes in appetite or weight, which is eating too much or too little, gaining or losing a significant amount of weight, sleep problems like sleeping too much or too little, visible restlessness or slowing down, fatigue, feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt, troubles concentrating or making decisions, and recurrent thoughts of death or suicide. Major depressive disorder is episodic, which means symptoms come in episodes that can last weeks or months, then lessen or go into remission, and sometimes return later. This is really different from someone just having a rough week or feeling sad about a very specific event that's happened. It is a cluster of symptoms that hang together and stick around. Major depressive disorder is common enough that if you haven't experienced it yourself, you almost certainly know someone who has. Each year, about 6 to 7% of adults in the United States meet criteria for major depression, and across a lifetime, that number rises to about 17%. Women are diagnosed at higher rates than men, which may reflect a mix of biological, social, and reporting differences. Depression rarely travels alone, and it often shows up alongside anxiety disorders and substance use disorders, which can make it harder to recognize and treat. Certain life circumstances raise the odds, so higher rates of depression are found among people who are unemployed, have lower income, live in urban settings, or are separated, divorced, or widowed. These factors don't cause depression by themselves, but they can increase stress, reduce support, and create conditions where an underlying vulnerability is more likely to turn into a full episode. It's important to remember that depression is not just an individual problem, it's shaped by relationships, economics, and environment as well. Within major depression, there are some important subtypes that change the pattern and timing of symptoms. A seasonal pattern means depressive episodes occur during a specific time of the year, often in the fall or winter, when there's less daylight, then lift in other seasons. People might notice that every year their energy drops, their sleep and appetite change, and they lose interest around the same months. A peripartum onset specifier is used when a depressive episode begins during pregnancy or within 4 weeks after childbirth. This is more intense than baby blues and can involve deep sadness, anxiety, and difficulty bonding with baby. Persistent depressive disorder, or dysthymia, is a different picture. Mood is depressed more days than not for at least 2 years, along with at least two other depressive symptoms. The intensity is often lower than a full major depressive disorder episode, but it's chronic. It can feel like this is who I am, which makes it really easy to overlook. Bipolar disorder involves shifts between depressive episodes and periods of mania or hypomania. During mania, a person may talk rapidly, sleep very little, feel unusually confident or powerful, and take on many tasks at once. Thoughts can race, what's called flight of ideas, and attention can jump quickly from one thing to another. Decision making tends to be impulsive, so risky behaviors with money, sex, or substances are really common. From the outside, the person might look energetic or amped up, but the consequences can be really serious. Bipolar disorder usually begins before age 25 and affects roughly 1 in 100 people over a lifetime. It carries a significant suicide risk. About a third of individuals with bipolar disorder will attempt suicide at one point, and often co-occurs with anxiety and substance use problems. The challenge in real life is that hypomanic periods can sometimes feel productive or even enjoyable, so people might seek help only when depression hits or when consequences of manic behavior catch up with them. So when you hear bipolar, do you picture a rapid mood swing across the day or longer stretches of distinct episodes? And how does that compare to the clinical description? Genetic studies make it clear that mood disorders have a biological component. For major depression, first-degree relatives of someone with major depressive disorder have roughly twice the risk of developing it themselves. Twin data shows higher concordance with identical twins than in fraternal twins, which points to inherited vulnerability rather than just a shared environment. For bipolar disorder, those genetic signals are even stronger. Relatives have about 9 times the usual risk, and identical twins' concordance rates are much higher than fraternal. Hormonal systems are also involved as well. People with depression often show elevated levels of cortisol. Cortisol can activate the amygdala, which is central for emotional responses, and dampen the activity of the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in planning and emotional regulation. When cortisol stays high over time, that pattern, stronger emotional reactions and weaker regulation, may become a risk factor for future depressive episodes. Mood disorders also involve changes in neurotransmitters, especially serotonin and norepinephrine. These chemicals help regulate systems like sleep, appetite, energy, and mood, all of which are commonly disrupted in depression and bipolar disorder. When their levels of functioning are off, it can affect how flexible mood is and how strongly someone reacts to stress. Many effective medications target these symptoms. So antidepressants such as SSRIs increase serotonin levels or activity and also impact norepinephrine. In bipolar disorder, lithium has been used as a mood stabilizer and appears to blunt norepinephrine activity at the synapse. None of these medications fix mood single-handedly, but they can create a more stable biological background so other supports like therapy, routines, and social connection have a better chance to help the person. Brain imaging studies show consistent patterns in depression. The amygdala, which helps evaluate the emotional significance of information, tends to be more active in depressed individuals when they're exposed to negative emotional stimuli like sad faces or negative words. That can mean negative information grabs attention more easily and hits harder emotionally. The prefrontal cortex, especially areas involved in planning, decision making, and regulating emotions, often shows reduced activation in depression. Together, this combination, the stronger automatic reaction to negative material and weaker regulation ability, makes it easier for someone to get stuck in negative mood states and harder to shift out of them. It doesn't explain everything, of course, but it does align with the lived experience of feeling overwhelmed by negative thoughts and emotions that just don't respond to just think positively. The diathesis stress model helps to link biology and the life events. Many people who develop major depression have gone through significant stressful life events, like loss, conflict, financial strain, or health problems. But not everyone who faces those events becomes depressed. The model suggests that an underlying vulnerability interacts with stress to produce the disorder. One example involves a gene related to the serotonin transporter. People with one or two short alleles of this gene seem to be more likely to develop depression if they also experience multiple stressful events. Without that stress, the gene alone doesn't predict much. Without the vulnerability, stress may still be hard, but less likely to lead to major depression. Studies also show that childhood maltreatment combined with this genetic vulnerability is linked to especially high rates of chronic depression in adulthood. It's the combination that matters the most. Cognitive theories shift the focus to how people think. Aaron Beck proposed that people who are vulnerable to depression tend to develop depressive schemas, deeply ingrained beliefs and mental frameworks centered on themes of loss, failure, rejection, worthlessness, or inadequacy. These often form in response to early experiences like criticism, neglect, or repeated failures. For a while, these schemas might be quiet, but when the stress hits, they become active and start shaping on how new events are interpreted. Once those schemas are activated, they create cognitive biases. A person might focus mainly on negative details, interpret neutral events as negative, and have trouble recalling positive experiences. This fits with Beck's idea of cognitive triad, negative views of the self, the world, and the future. The research support for this model is strong and forms the foundation of cognitive therapy, which tries to help people notice and modify these underlying patterns rather than just dealing with surface level symptoms. The hopelessness theory builds on this by focusing on how people explain negative events. If someone tends to see bad events as stable, this will always be this way, and global, this ruins everything, they are more likely to develop a sense of hopelessness, believing that nothing can improve and that they have no control. That hopelessness itself becomes a direct pathway into depression. Two people can experience the same setback, but the person who sees it as temporary and specific, this one thing went wrong, is less likely to become depressed than the person who sees it as permanent and all encompassing. Rumination is another cognitive process linked to depression. It means repeatedly turning distress over in your mind, thinking about how bad you feel, why you might feel that way, and what it might mean, without moving into problem solving or taking action. Rumination tends to prolong and intensify depressive episodes because the person stays immersed in negative thinking rather than getting any relief or new perspectives. Research suggests that women are more likely to ruminate than men, which may help explain part of the gender difference in depression rates. When someone when something goes wrong for you, do you notice yourself explaining it in a way that feels more stable and global, like it always happens to me? Or more temporary or specific? How do you think those explanations impact your mood? Suicide is a critical topic in any discussion of mood disorders. Around 90% of people who die by suicide are found to have at least one mental health disorder, often a mood disorder like major depression or bipolar disorder. In the United States, suicide has ranked among the top causes of death, and the numbers represent real people: family members, friends, coworkers, classmates. Men die by suicide at a higher rate, often using more lethal means such as firearms, while women make more attempts overall and more often use poisoning or overdose. Risk factors include substance abuse, a history of previous suicide attempts, and access to lethal means. Warning signs can show up as social withdrawal, talking about feeling like a burden, giving away possessions, major changes in behavior, or expressing that there's no way out. Experiences like cyberbullying, the suicide of a family member or friend, and certain patterns of serotonin dysfunction can also increase risk. From a psychological perspective, people considering suicide often feel trapped, like their pain will never end and that there's no other option. Recognizing these patterns is important because asking directly about suicidal thoughts and connecting someone to support can be life-saving. Schizophrenia is a severe mental health disorder that involves major disruptions in how a person thinks, perceives reality, manages emotions, and behaves. One of the most well-known symptoms is hallucinations, which are perceptual experiences that occur without any actual external stimulus. The most common type is an auditory hallucination, especially hearing voices that other people don't hear. These voices might comment on the person's behavior, insult them, or give commands. To the person experiencing them, they feel real and can be incredibly distressing. Another feature is delusions, which are strongly held beliefs that are clearly false and not shared by others in that culture. Paranoid delusions involve the belief that others, neighbors, the government, strangers, are plotting to harm or surveil them. Grandiose delusions, someone might believe that they have special powers, unique knowledge, or a secret identity. Somatic delusions focus on the body, like believing one's organs are rotting or infested. Some people also experience thoughts as being inserted into or removed from their mind by outside forces. And then on top of that, there can also be disorganized thinking, where speech becomes hard to follow because ideas jump around or connections are really loose. And disorganized or abnormal motor behavior, ranging from agitation to catatonia, where a person may sit rigidly, resist movement, or show very little response to the environment. Schizophrenia also includes negative symptoms, which are reductions in normal emotional and motivational functioning. Avolition shows up as a lack of motivation to start or continue meaningful activities like school, work, or self-care. Alogia is very limited speech. Answers may be brief or minimal. Asociality involves withdrawal from social relationships and little interest in connecting with others. And anhedonia is the reduced ability to feel pleasure, even from things that used to feel enjoyable. These negative symptoms can be easy to overlook or misinterpret as laziness or disinterest, but they are core parts of schizophrenia and often create as much disability as the hallucinations and delusions. Schizophrenia affects about 1% of the population, which sounds really small until you realize that in a city of 100,000 people, that's roughly 1,000 people living with it. Family and twin studies show a strong genetic component. If one parent has schizophrenia, the child's risk goes up several times compared to the general population, even if that child is adopted and raised elsewhere. So there's clearly an inherited vulnerability, but genes alone don't mean that someone is going to develop schizophrenia. One idea is that the dopamine hypothesis suggests that an overabundance of dopamine or too many dopamine receptors in certain brain pathways contribute to symptoms. Drugs that increase dopamine can trigger psychotic-like experiences, and medications that block dopamine receptors often reduce hallucinations and delusions. High dopamine activity in areas like the limbic system seems tied to positive symptoms, the hallucinations and delusions, while lower dopamine in the prefrontal cortex may be linked to negative symptoms like flat affect and lack of motivation. Brain imaging also shows enlarged ventricles and reduced gray matter in frontal regions, along with less frontal lobe activity during thinking tasks, which suggests structural and functional changes in brain circuits involved in planning and decision making. Events during pregnancy and birth also appear to play a role. Obstetric complications such as oxygen deprivation during delivery and maternal exposure to influenza in the first trimester have been associated with a higher risk of schizophrenia in children. High levels of emotional stress during pregnancy may add to that risk as well, but none of these factors alone, genes, dopamine, brain differences, and prenatal events, are sufficient to explain it all by themselves. But together they do support a diathesis stress picture. Certain vulnerabilities interact with environmental stressors to increase the likelihood that schizophrenia will emerge. Dissociative disorders are conditions where a person becomes split off from their usual sense of self, especially in terms of memory and identity. Instead of simply zoning out, these are more profound disruptions. People may lose access to important personal information, feel detached from their own body or experiences, or experience their identity as divided. These symptoms often follow severe stress or trauma and can be confusing both to the person themselves and to those around them. Dissociative amnesia involves an inability to recall important personal information, usually related to stressful or traumatic events. This isn't ordinary forgetfulness, it's actual gaps in memory that are too extensive to be explained by normal. In dissociative fugue, that amnesia is paired with unexpected travel. Someone suddenly leaves home, feels confused about who they are, and in some cases may even take on a new identity for a short period of time. When the fugue ends, they may not remember what happened while they were away. These patterns can look dramatic from the outside, but internally they're often tied to overwhelming experiences the mind is trying not to fully engage with. Depersonalization and derealization disorder centers on different kinds of splitting. In depersonalization, a person feels detached from themselves, like they're watching their own life from the outside, or their body, thoughts, or actions don't feel quite real. In derealization, the world feels unreal or distorted. People, objects, or surroundings may seem foggy, dreamlike, or just off. These episodes can be terrifying, especially if the person worries they're going crazy, but they're actually recognized dissociative symptoms. Dissociative identity disorder, or DID, involves two or more distinct identities or personality states, along with memory gaps for the times when another identity is the one in control. Many people with DID report a history of severe childhood trauma, and one way to understand the multiple identities is as a psychological strategy to survive experiences that feel impossible to handle as a single unified self. ADHD is classified as a neurodevelopmental disorder, which means symptoms show up early in development and affect how a child functions at home, in school, and with peers. The core features are a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactive impulsive behavior that gets in the way of normal daily life. Inattention can look like difficulty staying focused, not following through on instructions, losing track of materials, making what looks like careless mistakes, or seeming not to listen even when spoken to directly. Hyperactivity and impulsivity show up as fidgeting, getting in and out of one's seat, running or climbing when it's not appropriate, interrupting others, blurting out answers, or having a hard time waiting in line or taking turns. This goes beyond typical small kid energy, and it's frequent and pervasive across different settings. ADHD affects an estimated 5% of children, and boys are diagnosed more often than girls. Over time, ADHD can create real problems in school performance, friendships, driving, work, and relationships, especially when it's misunderstood as laziness, defiance, or just not trying hard enough. Many kids with ADHD hear a lot of criticism and may start to internalize the idea that they're bad or broken, when the reality is that their brain is wired differently to seek stimulation and has more difficulty with sustained attention and self-inhibition. Without supports, that translates into lower educational attainment, higher unemployment, substance use problems, and rocky relationships in adulthood. Research shows that ADHD has a strong genetic component. Symptoms of inattention and hyperactivity are highly heritable, which means they tend to run in families. On the brain chemistry level, dopamine seems to be especially important. Dopamine is involved in motivation, reward, and the ability to persist with tasks that aren't just immediately interesting. Children and adults with ADHD often show lower dopamine activity in brain networks, which helps explain why just try harder doesn't work very well as advice. Stimulant medications commonly used for ADHD work in part by increasing dopamine availability, which can improve focus and reduce impulsivity for many people. Brain imaging studies also point to differences in the frontal lobes, the areas that help with planning, organization, and inhibiting impulses. Some studies find smaller frontal lobe volume and less activation during mental tasks in people with ADHD. Since these regions are heavily involved in self-control and decision-making, differences here can show up as trouble sitting still, staying on task, or stopping to think before acting. None of this means a person with ADHD can't be successful. It just means that they may need different strategies, environments, and sometimes medication that respect how their nervous system works instead of treating it as purely a behavior problem. When you think about people that you've seen labeled as lazy or disruptive, how might your view shift if you consider ADHD as a brain-based difference in attention and inhibition rather than a character flaw? Autism spectrum disorder is another neurodevelopmental disorder, but it's different than ADHD. Autism spectrum disorder involves persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction, along with restricted repetitive behaviors, interests, or activities. Social communication differences can include limited eye contact, avoiding or turning away when spoken to, difficulty with back and forth conversation, or not picking up on nonverbal cues like facial expressions and tone of voice. Some individuals might use very few words, while others speak a lot but struggle with social timing or reading the other person's interests. Repetitive behaviors and restricted interests can look a lot like hand flapping, rocking, lining up toys in a specific way, intense focus on a particular topic, or strong resistance to changes in routine. For some, these behaviors are soothing or organizing. They help regulate sensory input or emotions. Autism spectrum disorder is currently estimated to affect about 1 in 88 kiddos. In the older data, though there are more recent estimates that say it could be even higher, and it is more commonly diagnosed in boys. Genetics play a major role. Identical twins show much higher match rates for autism than fraternal twins, and many of the genes involved relate to how brain cells connect and communicate. Environmental factors that increase the likelihood of new genetic changes may also play a role, but the strongest evidence is around neurodevelopment, not parenting style or emotional coldness. Because autism symptoms often become noticeable around the same age that children receive routine vaccines, some people assume that there must be a connection. This has been thoroughly investigated. Large, well-designed studies across different countries and time periods have found no reliable evidence that childhood vaccines, like the MMR vaccine, cause autism. The original study that sparked the vaccine autism scare was later found to have serious methodological and ethical problems and was retracted from the journal, and the lead author lost his medical license. The scientific consensus is very clear. Vaccines do not cause autism. Autism is strongly linked to genetic and neurodevelopmental factors, not to getting vaccinations. At the same time, vaccines are crucial for preventing serious illnesses like measles, mumps, rubella, diseases that can cause brain damage, disability, or death. So choosing not to vaccinate doesn't reduce autism risk, but it does increase the risk of more dangerous infections for both kiddo and communities. Understanding the actual causes of autism and the benefits of vaccines helps separate coincidence and timing from causation, and it pushes the conversation toward how to support autistic individuals and their families rather than blaming life-saving medical care. Personality disorders are patterns of thinking, feeling, behaving that are long-standing, inflexible, and pervasive across situations. They're not just having a big personality or being dramatic. They involve traits that differ significantly from cultural expectations and that cause real distress or impairment in work, relationships, or self-care. These patterns usually begin in adolescence or early adulthood and feel very built into the person's way of being, rather than coming and going like a mood episode. About 9% of the population in the United States are estimated to meet the criteria for at least one personality disorder, so they're not as rare as we seem to think they are sometimes. The DSM groups personality disorders into 3 clusters. Cluster A is described as odd or eccentric, paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders. Cluster B is dramatic, emotional, or erratic, so antisocial, histrionic, narcissistic, and borderline personality disorders. Cluster C is anxious or fearful, so avoidant, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders. Some, like avoidant and schizoid, are relatively frequent but may create less obvious disruption in others' lives, while antisocial and borderline personality disorders tend to be more problematic because of the level of risk, conflict, and distress involved for both the person and those around them. Borderline personality disorder is defined by instability, especially in relationships, self-image, and mood. Paired with impulsivity, people with BPD often experience intense fears of being abandoned and may make frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined rejection. Relationships can swing quickly between idealization, you're the best person I've ever met, and devaluation, you're just like everyone else who's hurt me, which can be confusing for both the person and their partners, friends, or family. Their sense of self can also feel very fragile, with sudden shifts in values, interests, career plans, or the kind of people they want to be close to. Impulsivity might show up in risky behaviors around money, sex, substances, or self-harm. Emotions can change very rapidly and feel really overwhelming, leading to episodes of intense anger, sarcasm, or verbal explosions that the person later regrets. Borderline personality disorder affects about 1 to 2% of the population and often co-occurs with things like anxiety, mood, and substance use disorders. Traits like emotional sensitivity and impulsivity appear to be highly heritable, and many people with borderline personality disorder report histories of childhood abuse or other adverse experiences. It can help to see borderline personality disorder not as a manipulative behavior, but as a pattern of coping that developed in response to real instability or threat, even if it now creates new problems. How might your reaction to someone's intense shifting emotions change if you see them as part of a long-standing pattern built on vulnerability and early experiences, rather than just attention seeking? Antisocial personality disorder involves a long-standing pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others. This goes beyond occasional rule breaking, and people with antisocial personality disorder often engage in repeated illegal acts, lying or conning for personal gain or pleasure, impulsive and reckless behaviors, and consistent failure to hold jobs, pay bills, or meet obligations. A key feature in antisocial personality disorder is a lack of remorse. So, hurting, exploiting, or deceiving others doesn't bring much guilt, and the consequences are often minimized or blamed on others. Many individuals with antisocial personality disorder present with an overinflated sense of self, superficial charm, and very little empathy. They may come across as confident or charismatic at first, but over time, a pattern of broken promises, aggression, and irresponsibility tends to emerge. To diagnose antisocial personality disorder, the person has to be at least 18 years old, and there must be evidence of conduct problems starting before the age of 15. Antisocial personality disorder is seen in a few percent of the population overall and is more common in males. It's often associated with criminal behavior, but not everyone ends up in the legal system. Some function in ways that keep them just inside or around the edges of formal consequences. The causes of antisocial personality disorder appear to involve an interaction of genetic vulnerability and adverse environments. Traits like fearlessness, impulsive antisociality, and callousness show strong genetic influence. Adoption studies suggest that when children who are already temperamentally at risk grow up in environments with abuse, neglect, inconsistent discipline, or criminal modeling, antisocial patterns are more likely to develop and persist. In contrast, a more structured and supportive environment can sometimes buffer against the vulnerability, even if it doesn't eliminate it completely. Emotionally, people with antisocial personality disorder often show reduced fear responses to cues that most people find aversive, things like punishment, pain, or signals that something bad is about to happen. Physiological measures such as lower skin conductance responses suggest that their bodies simply don't react as strongly to threat or distress cues. Brain imaging points to reduced activation in regions involved in empathy and concern for others, and relatively greater activation in regions tied to self-focusing processing. This pattern helps explain why someone with antisocial personality disorder can understand, at least on a cognitive level, that others are being harmed, but not feel moved in the same way to change their behavior. Psychological disorders touch whether through your own experience, someone in your family, friends, clients, or the people you pass every day. How we understand these conditions shapes whether people get help or hide, feel supported or shamed. This chapter gives you more ways to move beyond causal labels and stereotypes into a more accurate and humane understanding of what it means when thoughts, feelings, or behaviors interfere with daily life in serious ways. As you leave this chapter, notice the language you and others use around mental health. Pay attention to how easily crazy, psycho, or OCD get thrown around, and what that does to people who are actually living with these diagnoses. When you encounter someone struggling, see if you can pause and remember that what looks like difficult behavior from the outside may be someone doing the best they can with a brain and history that you can't see. Understanding psychological disorders isn't about turning you into a diagnostician. It's about strengthening your ability to recognize suffering, respect complexity, and respond with informed compassion.